You ready?
I'm ready, bro.
And please state your full name and your current occupation.
My name is Michael Moore, and I am a station captain in the fire department.
Okay. Michael, when did you begin working for Death Row and in what capacity?
I started working for Death Row back in 1994, and I was responsible for all the medical for Death Row, and later became a bodyguard. But my first job with Death Row was to handle all the medical calls, people getting injured, people getting hurt, that worked for Death Row.
Okay. Describe the atmosphere, the work environment at Death Row prior to September of 1996.
Chaos. A lot of chaos there, a lot of confusion. There were good days at Death Row and there were bad days at Death Row. It just depended on when you worked. When I first started in the medical capacity, there was a lot of fights that were going on at the studio, a lot of people, a lot of dog fights, a lot of one-on-one fights where people would be fighting, so I was pretty much needed. But after talking with Suge Knight, I was switched from medical to bodyguarding, and I started off in the studio and personal bodyguarding with Dr. Dre.
Okay. Mike, when did you begin to bodyguard Tupac? And did you bodyguard Pac or any other artists? Let me rephrase that. And if you mess up, there's no problem because we can edit.
Right.
Mike, when did you begin to bodyguard Tupac? Also, did you ever bodyguard any other artists besides Tupac?
The bodying of Tupac, for me, was a little different. Me and Pac didn't get along that well. I started on Pac as a substitute, filling in for Frank, filling in for Leslie, whoever was on him. I was more of a fill-in for that. The other bodyguards that I covered for Death Row was Dr. Dre.
The other artists?
The other artists were Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, the Outlaws, and Micheal. Them were the other artists that I covered while I was working for Death Row.
Okay, Mike. Tell us about a crazy story or situation that you experienced while you bodyguarded Pac on an average workday for Death Row.
I think one of the strangest things I've ever seen was in New York when Tupac had left New York, came to California, and we went back. We got into a confrontation at the park with a couple other artists from, what is that guy's name?
Nas.
With Nas at the park, and while we were there, they confronted each other right in the middle of the park, and on top of that, there was some pushing, there was some shoving, there was some name calling, and I don't think we really left on good terms. I knew going back to New York would be trouble for us if we ventured back there in the future.
Okay, so to kind of go over that question again, you said you guys were in New York, you left New York, went back to California, went back to New York?
Correct.
And got into the altercation?
Right.
Oh, wow. Okay. Mike, how does Suge treat security in your opinion?
On certain occasions, Suge treated us well. On other occasions, Mr. Knight didn't treat us so well, but a lot could have been that there was always chaos going on, and we wouldn't be a priority to him. The artist would be a priority. We were there to do a job. So I think if I have to look at the whole situation, I think we were just treated fair.
Okay. How about Tupac? How did Tupac treat security or yourself?
Like I mentioned earlier, me and Mr. Shakura didn't get along really well. I was mostly a fill-in when I was guarding, with Tupac. Personally, I didn't like him. To do the job, I can get the job done. I didn't like Pac for some of the things that he stood for versus some of the things that I stood for. But I think I can do the job as filling in. I don't think I want to really elaborate any more than that without going any further.
Okay. Okay, Mike, you mentioned that you heard a conversation over the security radio after Tupac was shot. Tell us about what you heard.
I was in the limo, me and Tupac, Outlaw Mortals. We were driving around in Harlem, and the radio came on with Snoop Dogg saying that he had no beef with New York, which sent Pac into a rage. Because Pac, of course, had big beef with New York, and Suge and Pac had basically a pact about it, but maybe Snoop wasn't included, or Snoop was basically saying, hey, I don't have a beef with them. That set Tupac off, and we immediately spun the limo around, and we went back to the hotel to confront Snoop. We couldn't find him, but we found Mr. Knight, and that's who Tupac confronted about what was going on the radio while we were in New York.
Okay. I think you kind of misunderstood that question a little bit. We can edit that whole thing out, don't worry about it. Okay. Mike, you mentioned that you heard a conversation over the security radio the night that Tupac was shot, but this was after he was shot. So let's say Tupac was shot on September the 7th at 11 p.m. A radio message came across the radio. Tell us about what you heard while you were at
that
Club
question's
666.
the question's phrased a little wrong, though. I know we can edit this out, but what you're saying is, while I was working at 662, I heard something over the Nextels that we all carried for security, and what I heard was, got him.
Okay. Did you recognize the voice?
The voice was definitely one of our, not paid security, but one of security that works with directly for Mr. Knight, came over the radio. Now, I couldn't pinpoint exactly whose voice it was, but it was some voice that I had heard before. So I knew it was one of our, not one of our direct security that was hired with us, but one of the, what would we call them? What would we call them? One of the homeboy securities. You said, got him, right before me and Mr. Wright got in the vehicle to go get to the hospital. But at the same time he said that, he said, then someone else came on the radio and said, hey, don't say nothing over the radio, which was the Nextels we were using radio to radio.
Okay, that voice that said, don't say anything over the radio, did you recognize that voice by chance?
No, because at the time, Mr. Wright and I were talking about what had happened, and I just clearly heard somebody say, don't say that over the radio. But the person who said it was not homeboy security, nor was it one of our security guards. It was, to me, it would be like a stranger. Someone, and the person that said that was Caucasian, definitely not African American.
Okay. All right, Mike, did Tupac mention that he did not want to go to Las Vegas? What did he say about going to Vegas, if so?
Tupac didn't want to go to Vegas, and how that came about was when we were in New York, he was livid about what had happened while he was in New York. So he did not want to go to Vegas. Matter of fact, he fought off going to Vegas all the way to the last second. And when I got there, I was surprised to see him there because I didn't think he was going to go, because he had told us that he was not going there with, his words, them sellout niggas to Vegas after what had happened.
Why would he say he didn't want to go to Vegas with those sellout niggas? Who was he talking about?
Well, he was referring to Snoop and what the comment Snoop had made over the radio while we were in the limo.
This would have been when you guys were in New York.
Correct.
During the MTV
Awards, Music Awards.
The week before Tupac was shot.
Right.
Okay. Mike, were Pac and Suge on good terms when he left New York? When was Pac planning on leaving Death Row, if you even know?
I can go in that a little bit. I was there when an argument took place between Tupac and Mr. Knight in the hotel room about what had happened. That was the first time I heard Machiavelli, and Pac's words were, I'm gonna cut out Machiavelli, and when I cut out Machiavelli, I'm the hell up out of here. You got your money, I don't want nothing else to do with Death Row, I'm out. That's how we left that day.
Who was Tupac talking to?
And he was talking to Mr. Knight.
And where were you at?
I was in the room, I was asked to stay, which is sort of strange. On most of the occasions that Mr. Knight deals with Tupac, I am told to step outside the room. On this occasion, I was told to stay inside the room with Mr. Knight while they were arguing.
Now, you said they were arguing. They were arguing in New York. This was during the MTV Awards.
Correct. This was in New York after the MTV Music Awards. Prior to us going home, There was an altercation about what Snoop had done. He was displeased that Tupac was displeased about what had happened, and what he was basically saying was, and this is the first time I've ever heard of Machiavelli before it even came out to be a CD record, that he's going to give Suge all the rights to Machiavelli. He just wants his freedom, and he wants off death row.
And Suge didn't want to hear that.
And Mr. Knight was very upset, and they got to yelling at each other back and forth. They confronted each other basically to a face-to-face. I did slide in between them and said, hey, you know, you can't do this while I'm here, or I am going to have to step out of the room. And then they said, you know, then Tupac said, hey, fuck it, I'm out of here. And that's what happened.
Did they ask you to leave prior to this conversation? Why were you in the room? How did you have the privilege of staying in the room with this conversation?
Normally, I am asked in every situation that I can remember while working with Death Row, when there was altercations, fights, where some type of discipline was going to be passed out during Death Row, I'm usually asked to step outside the room. But on this occasion, I think Mr. Knight had me stay for the safety of Tupac. I believe that's the reason I was there, because I think Mr. Knight, with me not being there, he would have put his hands on him. He was that upset.
Mr. Knight was?
Mr. Knight was at Tupac, and Tupac at Mr. Knight, but just expressing himself basically because he was displeased what Snoop had said about him.
Okay. When you and the other bodyguards took Tupac to the airport to return back to California, what did Tupac tell you specifically?
The last thing he said to me prior to leaving was, he's not going to be in Vegas. I don't have to worry about him showing up, and don't worry about it because he won't be there. That's what he told me right before we put him on the plane.
Did you ever hear the phrase from Tupac that night that he himself said, "I'm a dead man walking"?
No, because who walked him directly to the vehicle and set him inside the thing was Al Giddens. I was a little further back. They had another conversation, but I just didn't hear it.
Okay. Mike, did Tupac get into any altercations while in New York during the MTV Awards?
I'm really not sure. Not that I can recall.
The park incident.
Oh, well, that's what you want me to cover now?
Yeah, that covers the park incident.
Yes, we got into an altercation with another rapper by the name of Nas. Him and Nas had a face-off after the MTV Music Award was over. We were at a party, and they basically did a face-off. What put me between Nas, Pac, at a park in New York, which was some type of party we went to.
Okay, Mike. After Pac was shot, what was Suge's view and his attitude about security?
He was very displeased with security because Mr. Knight believed that we shared some of the responsibility for him getting shot.
Why wasn't Tupac's bodyguard, Frank, assigned to Tupac while he was in New York?
I'm not sure why Frank wasn't on Tupac prior to going to New York, but I can tell you that Mr. Reggie made a mistake prior to that happening. I brought it to his attention that he needed to have additional bodyguards while we were in New York simply because of what had happened prior. We had a dinner meeting, make that a lunch meeting, thank God it's Fridays, I believe, in Las Vegas prior to the fight starting, and I was told that I'd be taken off Tupac Shakur for the night of the fight.
Pause for a second, bro.
Go ahead.
All right, Mike, why wasn't Frank assigned to bodyguard Tupac while he was in New York when you guys were there?
Frank was on vacation at the time. We were heading to New York, me and Reggie. Reggie did call Frank and ask him if he wanted to come. Frank wanted to come, but we were on our way to the airport, and Reggie just said, fuck it, we're going to go ahead and roll with what we got.
Okay.
And then we went on to New York.
Okay. Mike, do you have any knowledge of why Tupac was killed, in your opinion?
My opinion is that Tupac's death is more related to death row than it is any other theory that they came up with. Due to what I heard in New York about the Machiavelli album, about him requesting his freedom, about him wanting to start his own production company, about him wanting to work more in films. I think Tupac wanted to leave, and I don't think Death Row wanted him to go.
Now, that's strictly your opinion.
Now, that is my opinion of what happened.
Mike, were you still working for Death Row at the time Biggie was killed in Los Angeles 6 months later?
Yes, I was working for Death Row up to a year later after Tupac was killed.
Were you ever privileged to any conversations regarding Biggie's death or while he was in LA prior to being killed?
I wasn't privy to any statements that anyone made about his death, but I did see a lot of pictures and a lot of things defaming Biggie, where we had other artists come to the studio and draw ridiculous pictures of Biggie and other artists that worked out of New York.
Okay. What was the mood at Death Row after Tupac's death and after Biggie's death? Were you witness to any conversations regarding Biggie's death?
No, I wasn't, like I stated earlier, I wasn't there to hear anyone directly threaten Biggie or any other artist from New York. I just know that the atmosphere was hate for any of the artists through New York, not with Snoop, because Snoop, basically, his theory was to get along with everyone. The real hate was generated from Tupac and Mr. Knight.
Okay, Mike. Have you ever been interviewed by any federal law agencies such as LAPD, Las Vegas PD, or the FBI?
I was never entered by any of the police agencies. I was never interviewed by any of the police agencies, the FBI, nor Las Vegas PD. And I found that to be a little strange because for the last week, I was with Tupac and I didn't get a single question from anyone about what I thought, what my theory was on what happened, nor about the Nextel phones where I had heard the conversation that said, got him.
Okay. Mike, why are you coming forward with this information now?
I'm coming forward with the information because someone asked me and I was willing to tell them what I knew. No one in the past has ever asked me anything about Tupac, even though when you look at the MTV Music Award tapes and when you look at his whole last week, you'll see me there. I was there in Vegas when he was shot. I was one of the first people to the hospital, but I was never interviewed by anyone. So I'm just coming forth now to set the record straight that some of the things that happened to Tupac, we need to check within Death Row before we start pointing the fingers at other people.
Okay, Mike, you keep talking about Death Row and needing to be checked into Death Row because of Tupac's death, murder. Why are you so adamant to want to look at Death Row and no one else really has?
I think, and the reason I'm so adamant about Death Row is one thing, and it never went away. And I talked with two people, the word got him. And what happened prior to Tupac dying. The 4 phone calls I received in my hotel room about me calling up to my room asking me where I was at. What was I doing? Because they removed me from Tupac and I thought that was strange because I had been with him the whole week. And I even questioned security about the security owner. Why would you take me off if I had been on him the whole week? And then they constantly kept calling my hotel room, and I shared a room with Tim Williams, and they were checking on me, finding out where I was at.
Now, you're saying, none of this is in here. Now, you're saying they were calling your room. Who were they, and what room were they calling, and at what time, not daytime, but what time frame were they calling your room? Was it in New York, or was this in Las Vegas?
This is Las Vegas prior to Tupac dying. I was a little upset that I was taken off of him, and I got into a little argument with Reggie Wright at lunch over it. He said, Mike, I'm putting Frank back on him, and I'm taking you back off. And I said, Reggie, that part doesn't make sense. Why not leave me and Frank on Tupac? And he said, Michael Moore, do what you're told. I'm going to put you at Club 662, and you're going to handle the security along with Al Giddens at the club. And then I said, Reggie, that doesn't make sense. Now, what made me believe that Death Row had more to do with it was how it was done. When Reggie did that and I questioned it, Reggie did something that he's never done. He's never stayed at 662. That day, he stayed at the club. Then why would he need me there? And why would I be taking off with Tupac? You put Tupac at risk when you remove one bodyguard and say, hey, Frank, you handle him. So for most of the day, all this went on, and Tupac did not have a clue that's what we were doing. Tupac even called Reggie and had Frank get in touch with Reggie to find out where Michael Moore was at. So the problem was festering, and I knew something wasn't right. So when I went to my hotel room, I told Tim Williams, something is not right here, Tim. What we have to do is find out what's going on. So I said, let me go downstairs, and I'll change clothes, and I'll work with Tupac until Reggie says something. Tim said, Mike, don't do it. He goes, you're going to piss Reggie off, don't do it. I go, Tim, Frank's going to need some help. He said, don't do it. Just get dressed and go to the club. Well, we got down to the MGM, right in the front of it, right where the fight was at, and I was getting ready to get out of the car. I rode with Tim Williams over there. He goes, Mike, what are you doing? I said, Tim, I should just get out. Because if Reggie yells at me and I'm covering Tupac, how bad can that be? Well, at the last second, I decided to just stay in the car. I went to Club 662, and then when I look back at all the events that took place, I'm more to believe that we had something to do with Tupac's death than an outside source. Because the way it happened, you would never take off. Tupac was one of the biggest rap artists out there. Why would you take it and put one man in charge of that? When you had two men prior to Tupac dying. It didn't make sense. I challenged it at the time, and I know this isn't really in some of the questions that you're answering, but I think this needs to be let out. And it probably hasn't been. I've looked at a lot of interviews. I've looked at a lot of people's tapes and seen what you said in your book. We were told specifically, do not carry your weapon. That's what we were told. Now, I, at the meeting, was asked one of the few questions. Why would you tell us not to carry our weapons? So there was a running thing there about the weapons. I think the reason they removed me from Tupac is because I was one of the few people that wouldn't buy into not carrying your weapon. And during no part of that day did I take my weapon off. And Mr. Wright knew that. So they removed me off Tupac so there wouldn't be a weapon there. And that's what I believe.
Okay. Now, the story that you just explained, that happened on September 7th of 1996. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so we're talking about the actual day earlier before Tupac was shot.
That is prior to Tupac being shot.
Okay.
We met at an attorney's house, which is another thing that's unusual. I've been to Club 662 on many of occasions, and never have they told me to leave my weapons, either in my room or my car. So I questioned them. Why would I leave my weapons in a vehicle or in the hotel room, and I'm personally guarding Pac in one of the most hottest places to be? As far as there was going to be a lot of commotion, there was going to be a lot of people, and what that's going to make it is a bodyguarding incident where only thing you would have on you is your person.
So are you basically, Mike, in your own words, saying that you and Frank was with Tupac on September 7th, earlier that day? Tupac later on that evening asked you to go change clothes and to meet him over at the MGM with Frank.
That's correct.
At that time, you didn't show up. Why didn't you show up to meet Frank and Tupac at the MGM?
Well, I was changing clothes, and when I went to change clothes, they had an incident at the MGM Grand, so I missed them because they walked back, I walked too. So I missed them. Matter of fact, when I came back downstairs, I was looking for Frank and Tupac, but I couldn't find them because we were at the Lexor, and that's where my room was at. And when I got dressed, I had no idea where they were at. There again, our communications we didn't have together. Normally, Frank and I would both have radios, and Frank could just say, hey, Mike, we're over here. There was no radio again. That day, Frank doesn't have a radio, I don't have a radio, which I normally have, and we have confusion. So therefore, it was very difficult for me to get back up and catch up to Frank and Pac. And how I found him was on an accident. I ran into him a little bit later. At that time, though, Frank needed to change his clothes. So Frank had to leave to go change his clothes to get back to Pac. But it was confusion, and it was things that we normally don't do.
Okay, Mike, did you leave Death Row or Right Way on your own accord, or were you fired?
I actually left Death Row on my own accord. I put in my work for him, I did my time with him, and I talked to Reggie Wright about it. Reggie Wright and me had different opinions on security, and I think I spent 1.5 years with Death Row after that, and then I walked.
Before you left, did you ever have any conversation with Suge Knight prior to you leaving Death Row and Right Way Security?
Yes, I did have I went to the prison, talked to him, and let him know I was leaving.
Why did you do that? Why would you go to the prison to tell Suge you were leaving security?
I was hired by Mr. Knight when I first got started in this, and I felt it was the thing to do, to let him know, hey, I was leaving. I had some loyalty to Death Row, and I still do. I just think that it was the thing to do, talk to Mr. Knight, let him know that I was leaving, so that I can be clear of Death Row to myself.
Okay. Did you ever witness any threats made by Suge against Tupac or vice versa?
There were some threats made in both directions when we were in New York over what had happened over the radio. They were screaming back and forth at each other, and how I seen it, they both threatened each other. Tupac's threat being the biggest threat by saying he wants out, he wants to leave, and like I explained earlier, that covered Machiavelli because I had no idea what Machiavelli was, and he was screaming Machiavelli at the top of his lungs. So looking back on it now, knowing what Machiavelli is, it was Tupac saying, you could have Machiavelli, but I want my freedom.
Okay, you've mentioned a couple of times over the radio. Let's kind of set it straight when we're talking about the radio. Over the radio meaning what? You saying you guys were in New York at this time. You said over the radio.
What I mean by over the radio is it's Snoop basically saying he has no beef with no artist in New York.
Okay. Mike.
Excuse me.
Mm-hmm. We can pause it anytime you want to you want to get something to drink or anything?
No.
Okay. Mike, were you ever called to Suge's Las Vegas home in between the time that Tupac was shot and when he died?
No.
Okay. Okay, let's get that. What is your best memory of being with Tupac, Mike?
I have to say my best memory with Tupac was in Rome when Tupac was on a drug called ecstasy. I hope I got that right. And he was up all night dancing. I think that's the greatest memory I have of him because that was really him doing a little dirt, staying up all night, and being who he was. And then that night getting on stage, even though he didn't have to, and putting on a little concert for them over there. And I think when I look back on it all, that's my greatest moment of him.
Okay. Mike, would you characterize Death Row Records as being a very business-like environment?
No, it was far from business-like. Matter of fact, it was one of the worst run organizations that I've ever been involved with as far as on a professional level. It had more drama in a day than I've had in the fire service in 19 years.
Okay, Mike. The night of September 6th, who pulled Tupac? Let me rephrase that. The night of September 6th, Mike, who pulled you from bodyguarding Tupac? and told you to go back to Club 662?
That would be Reggie Wright, the owner of Right Way Security.
Why did Reggie pull you off of Tupac and have you go over to 662? Had you been with him earlier that day?
That is where a lot of the confusion started. I questioned it from the minute I heard it. I stated earlier, to me, that's the beginning of our downfall. That's the beginning of security starting to slip. And that's why I believe that we should have looked into death row prior to looking in and pointing the finger at anyone else. Because we took steps that we normally don't do.
Okay, Mike, at what time were you told to go back to 662, and for what reason were you told?
I was told to go to 662 that afternoon and that I should not be bodyguarding Tupac at all, that Frank Alexander was going to pick him up, and that I was not to be with him at all.
Okay. When you got to Club 662, Mike, what did you do? And in your opinion, would it made more sense for you to have been with Suge, Tupac, and Frank?
My normal responsibilities at Club 662 was outside security. I did most of the pat downs of all the males coming into the store, into the nightclub, checking for weapons. That was my number one responsibility. But that job is normally not done by me if Mr. Wright had more than enough people. Normally, I would be assisting other bodyguards if we had other artists there. But that night, I was instructed to be in charge of pat downs at the front door prior to people coming inside the club.
Okay, Mike, you've seen Before I Wake in its entirety. Is there any part of Frank's story that you would dispute? Does it in any way contradict what you remember?
No, I think the story is pretty accurate. I think Frank had his version from what he saw, but I think things he didn't see, he didn't speak on or he didn't elaborate on. The thing about the phone calls that I received in my room, I think Frank had no idea that I received them 4 phone calls prior to Tupac getting killed. The reason I place a lot of importance on the phone call is because Mr. Wright knew that I was pretty stubborn, and he basically knew that I wouldn't take my weapon off. So they kept checking to see where I was at. Well, if Mr. Wright told me to show up at the club at 10 o'clock, why did he start calling my room at 8? That's 2 hours. I think there was a reason for that. And I think the reason was making sure that no one carried a weapon.
Mike, who kept calling you? Who was those 4 phone calls from?
The phone calls came from Mr. Wright himself. So 3 of the phone calls came from Mr. Wright, and 1 phone call came from Al Giddens, who was also head of 662 security. And I asked him, I go, Al, why are you calling my room at 10 after 8 if I'm not supposed to be there till 10? And his answer was, Reggie just called me and told me to call you. I said, well, don't call me no more. And then after that, all my phone calls came directly from Mr. Wright.
Okay, Mike. That afternoon of September the 7th, when you and Tupac left the MGM Grand to go back over to the Lexor, what was Tupac's mood? Why did you leave him alone wandering in the lobby at the Lexor Hotel? What were you doing at that time?
Once again, at that time, I was really instructed not to be on Tupac. The time that you see me between the MGM Grand and you see me at the Lexor, I'm actually doing that on my own. I am really not supposed to be there because that lunch, prior to that, while at lunch, I was instructed to be strictly at 662. So what I did is I seen Tupac wandering around, roaming around with Frank, and I just, on my own, went in and decided to help out as best I could prior to that.
Pause for a second. Mike, the afternoon of September 7th, when you and Tupac left the MGM Grand to go back over to the Lexor, what was Tupac's mood like? When did you leave him alone wandering in the lobby of the Lexor Hotel? What were you doing at that time?
Tupac was in a fair mood. We had left. He's a very impatient person. He got impatient and he wanted to leave. So we left the MGM Grand and went back to the Lexor. Then I took Tupac all the way upstairs to his room and dropped him off. And then I went to my room, and that is how I left Tupac. And the reason was, I explained to Tupac while we were walking back from the MGM Grand, that Mr. Wright had took me off of him. He was a little upset. He made a couple phone calls. I wasn't privy to what he had said. I heard him talking to someone, but he was upset because Mr. Wright took me off of